I'm Becca Ballot. I'm the Executive Director of Our Oregon, and I use she, her pronouns. Sharing today with my friends Elizabeth and Sunny about our experience in Oregon. Just for context, since 1995, Oregon has seen 187 measures on their ballot. In fact, my first experience working for Our Oregon was in 1996, and there were 25 measures on the ballot. So as you can see, it is the place to be for ballot measures, and we've been very prolific. Our Oregon, for that reason, Our Oregon was founded as the, I think, only permanent infrastructure in the states as it relates to ballot measure campaigns. So we are a year-round organization who really wanted to move from these episodic campaigns. And when we first started, it was really our origin story was defense, to this permanent infrastructure where we didn't have to reinvent the wheel every year. So since 1995, Our Oregon has been around for the purpose of defeating harmful ballot measures on the ballot, like tax on immigrants and abortion, to promoting ballot measures like the minimum wage. And we've had a lot of success measured by in the win column, certainly, but one of the things that we learned over time and still have a lot of work to do is really, while we went from episodic to long-term, we still stayed in this kind of transactional space that wasn't rooted in a deep way in racial equity. So over the past couple of years, we have been going through this transformation with our coalition and with our practices to open up and democratize the space. While we were winning to have this permanent ballot measure infrastructure in Oregon, we were doing so at a cost, meaning that the knowledge was really centralized with a couple of really smart folks who knew how to run ballot measures. So we've been spending the time in the last few years really democratizing that information and sharing all the knowledge that we have and other practitioners have with as many folks as possible, with a particular emphasis on BIPOC individuals and organizations. And in fact, and we also, what we do is one of the things that we do is we convene the ballot measure table. And we have done that for the last 10, 15 years. And while we do it in the election cycle and bring all the ballot measure campaigns together to leverage resources and not duplicate efforts and to strategize together, we also now do it year round, regardless of cycle, to create a learning space for organizations, from everything from how does an organization, especially the newer BIPOC C4s, how do you develop an endorsement process, to how do you fundraise for ballot measures, and how do you get involved in a policy development? And also supporting campaigns from the very beginning. So I've had the pleasure with working with a bunch of really awesome folks who manage and run and lead campaigns. Another thing I just want to talk about in terms of our journey is, we are changing both practice as well as approach to how we do things as a coalition and how we do things individually as campaigns. And what has been super helpful, Oregon has been very lucky and proud to be a part of BISC's development of the Declaration of Cooperation, which was, has been an intentional process of the last couple of years. I know you'll hear more about it later in your time here at Road Ahead, where we redefined what success looked like. And of course, success still includes passage of a ballot measure, but it also includes building durable power and impact to communities and looking at every aspect of the standard of practice in your campaign through a racial equity lens. And I want to highlight a couple of ways in which that is happening in Oregon, in addition to what Elizabeth and Sunny have already talked about. One is around staffing practices. So, the ongoing lament from folks who, from progressive organizations, they say that, there aren't any folks of color. I can't find them. They don't have any experience. And that is collectively completely our fault who've been in the space. We have not created the space or opportunity for folks of color to work on campaigns. So there's a couple of things that we've been talking about with partners. One is doing an off-cycle campaign school that is specific and tailored to Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color that, basically teaches you all the skill, but it's also rooted in kind of trauma-informed approach, because you're going to have a different experience as a person of color on a campaign. So looking off cycle to put together, kind of create opportunities and a field team for folks of color to get that experience and knowledge and training. We're also talking to funders about creating fellowships on campaign, because you can sit in a classroom and learn about things, but really, unless you're on a campaign, it's really hard to imagine. So having funders, and on ballot measures, actually, you can get C3 funders to do this, to create fellowship opportunities for folks to learn on the job, or to essentially make an organization, a Black, Indigenous, or other folks of color organization whole, so they can lend their staff to that effort and return and bring that content knowledge back into the fold. I also just wanted to share a story with you. So I think I mentioned earlier that while I've only been the executive director of our organ for 3 years, I've been working in and around the organization from the beginning. And I was involved in 2008 with a slate of ballot measures that we were trying mostly to defeat. And one of them was a limitation. It was basically an attack on immigrant families, and it would have limited instruction for kids who are English language learners. And a few years ago, I had a conversation with the leader of an immigrant rights organization, who said their experience with that campaign, of which I was a part, was really traumatic, because they were not given access to the decision-making table to help make decisions on how that campaign would go in terms of impact, and their families were the most impacted. And that has just stuck with me, and I carry it into every single room that I'm in. The good news is that the same organization is now deeply engaged in ballot measure work. They run paid field programs. They have the last couple of ballot measure cycles. They're sitting at steering committee tables, but the harm that happened, more than a decade ago, is still lingering, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we don't make that mistake again. And I'll kick it over to Elizabeth Shepard.
Elizabeth Shepard, she, her, hers, campaign manager of the Yes on 108 vape and tobacco tax campaign that was on the November ballot of last year. It was really great to hear you give that overview, Becca, particularly as someone who used to work at our organ. That really synthesized everything we know. So with my particular measure, we really started from a place of knowing two things. First is that when you are passing a tax that is, a tax on a particular consumer good, and one that is addictive, like vape products, like tobacco products, there's a certain amount of accountability that is required. And that accountability starts at the policymaking process, but that accountability must carry over into the campaign process as well. So that was one piece. The other piece that we knew is that we were starting from a place of recognizing that lived experience is just as valuable as professional experience. Combining those two principles, we decided to form what was called an equity advisory committee for the campaign. So just to go back a little bit, when you look at vape and tobacco use, certainly across the country and in Oregon, you're going to see many BIPOC communities that are disproportionately using these products. That is because they are disproportionately targeted by tobacco companies as consumers. If you go into a predominantly Black neighborhood, you're going to see 10 times the amount of tobacco advertisement as you would in a predominantly white neighborhood. So having that data, having that knowledge, recognizing the communities that are impacted in terms of both economic and health outcomes as a result of tobacco use and addiction that are targeted to them, we were able to identify 5 to 7 key communities that we knew needed to be central in everything that we did in the campaign in terms of how we conducted our polling, how we did community outreach, what our messages were, what languages were we translating materials into, answering all of those really key questions directly from the folks impacted by the measure. So we were able to assemble a table made up of a representative from Black organization, representative from Latinx organization, Native American Indigenous organization, LGBTQ, API, Micronesian. So we brought these folks together with basically a scope of work, recognizing, again, going back to that principle that lived experience is just as valuable as professional experience, right? We brought these folks together with a specific scope of work. Now, this was the really groundbreaking thing for us that we were able to do through a lot of conversations, through a lot of uncomfortable, frankly, conversations with the folks funding the campaign, is that we thought it was absolutely critical to compensate these individuals for their expertise. And I think a good way to think about this is on campaigns, a huge portion of our budget goes to consultants, goes to people who tell you where to send the mail, what the digital advertisement should look like, what your top messages are, what your polling is. We spend a lot of money on those types of things and appraise those things at a very, very high value. Often, historically, what we will overlook in a campaign is, that moment when you are wondering what API languages to translate a voter pamphlet statement in. We have an expectation that we're able to call organization X representing that community and get that insight for free. That's no longer, I believe, an acceptable practice. And we have to be compensating that expertise and appraising its value just as high as we do where to target your mail.
My name's Sunny Mukesh Mehta. I'm the campaign manager, was the campaign manager for Yes on Measure 107 to amend Oregon's constitution to allow for campaign finance reform. And I identify with he, him pronouns. I think one thing that, I originally was drawn, first, let me just start off saying that Measure 107 passed by the largest margin by a ballot measure in over 20 years, which was impressive, but also just testament to how popular the issue is. And it was the first time that campaign finance, what really drew me in like a magnet was that this was the first time that campaign finance reform had truly come together, recognizing that now more than ever, that we need to be lifting up communities of color, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI voices, and I think that what set us apart, but also building on the work that Becca and Elizabeth and so many others have been working so hard on for so long, is the MOU that was put together. That was essentially a framework, almost very similar from the No on Measure 105, the anti-immigrant racist ballot measure that was on the ballot in 2018. So we were able to build off of that and put together a campaign committee that was made that had shared decision-making structures, and similarly to Elizabeth's campaign, did do polling, making sure that we were that our polling subcommittee was part of the question and design process. And I think one thing that as all of us have probably noticed and seen as the years have gone on, it has become more and more intentional, and we're really at an inflection point when it comes to prioritizing and putting those communities and voices that are going to be most impacted beneficially from progressive policies first, and at the table. And that's important. And I think that it goes to show like how much we were able to win by, and how successful we were in getting a wide, diverse group of folks together, where traditionally campaign finance reform has been mostly very philosophical, has been mostly in the kind of traditional white progressive kind of sphere of activism, and now it's been recognized, and we did it by our campaign by showing that like actually the most important voices that we need to be centering in this policy are those communities that are going to be benefiting the most.